March 15, 2019. Detective Frank Morales had been clean for 3 years. No bribes, no deals, no blood money. That's exactly why the package on his doorstep felt like ice in his chest. Inside, surveillance photos of his daughter Maria walking his 6-year-old grandson to school in San Diego. Time stamped from yesterday morning, and a handwritten note in perfect Spanish. You have 48 hours to return what you stole, or they disappear forever. Frank's hands shook as he dialed Maria's number. Straight to voicemail. Again. The DEA had promised him witness protection after he gave up El Chapo's location for $2 million. They promised his family would be safe. What they didn't tell him was that the man he betrayed had a brother with a longer memory and deeper pockets than the cartel Frank thought he'd destroyed. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Frank's weathered fingers traced the edges of the photographs one more time, studying every shadow in the background, every face that might be watching. The morning sun streaming through his kitchen window felt cold against his skin as he spread the images across his scarred wooden table, the same table where he'd counted cartel money years ago, back when his conscience had a price. The house creaked around him, settling into another day of his carefully constructed isolation. For 3 years, this one-bedroom shack 50 meters from the Pacific had been his sanctuary. No neighbors within shouting distance, no past to haunt him. Just the endless rhythm of waves against rocks and the occasional fishing boat heading out before dawn. He'd built this life deliberately small. Coffee at sunrise, morning walk along the beach collecting shells he'd never keep, afternoon reading, mostly detective novels, the irony not lost on him. Evening tequila, just one glass, watching the sunset paint the water gold. Sleep came easier here than it had in 30 years of police work in Tijuana, where every knock on the door might be a bullet or a badge. But now the past had found him anyway. Frank pushed back from the table and walked to the window facing the dirt road that connected his refuge to the outside world. Empty, as always. The photographer could have been anywhere, hidden in the scrub brush, using a telephoto lens from the hills, or simply walking past like any other stranger in San Diego. Professional work, patient work, the kind that costs serious money. His cell phone buzzed against the table. Frank lunged for it, hoping to see Maria's name, but the screen showed only a text from his former partner, Roberto. Heard through channels, someone's been asking about you and TJ. Might want to lay low. Too late for that advice. Frank deleted the message and tried Maria's number again. This time it didn't even ring, straight to a recording that her voicemail was full. His daughter had always been stubborn about checking messages, but she answered her phone religiously when it came to Diego's school, her job at the hospital, anything important. The silence felt deliberate, controlled. Frank moved to his bedroom closet and pulled out the metal lockbox hidden beneath old blankets and fishing gear. Inside, wrapped in oiled cloth, lay his service weapon, a Glock 22 he'd carried for 15 years before retirement. Beside it sat a thick envelope containing $20,000 in mixed bills, his emergency fund for a day exactly like this one. His fingers found the weight of the gun familiar and terrible. The DEA had debriefed him for 6 weeks after the operation. Agent Sarah Chen, young and intense, had walked him through every detail of what they called Operation Checkmate, the coordinated raid that had taken down what they believed was Joaquin Guzman's primary safe house in Culiacan. Frank's information had been perfect: guard positions, entry points, the exact room where El Chapo slept. Except the man they'd captured that night hadn't been El Chapo. Frank had learned the truth 3 months later, reading about Miguel Guzman's conviction in a newspaper. The resemblance between the brothers was strong enough that even DEA facial recognition software had initially confirmed the identity. By the time they realized their mistake, Frank was already in hiding with his money, and the real Joaquin Guzman had vanished deeper into the shadows. Miguel was his weakness, Frank whispered to himself, remembering something a cartel informant had told him years earlier. El Chapo would burn down Mexico City for that boy. The package had contained no return address, no postmark he could trace. But the message was clear enough. Frank had cost El Chapo his younger brother, the one family member Joaquin had tried to keep away from the business, the college-educated son who'd been dragged into cartel life only because their father needed someone he could trust completely. Frank's hands moved automatically, checking the Glock's magazine chambering around. 3 years of fishing and reading had softened his body, but muscle memory ran deeper than comfort. He'd killed 4 men during his police career, each one in the line of duty, each one justified. This felt different. This felt personal. The photographs seemed to stare at him from the kitchen table. Maria walking Diego to Balboa Elementary, her nurse's scrubs visible beneath her jacket. Diego's backpack covered in dinosaur patches. Both of them unaware they were being watched, catalogued, measured for leverage against a man they barely spoke to anymore. Frank had chosen isolation to protect them. After Elena's funeral 5 years ago, after the guilt of dirty money had finally broken his marriage posthumously, he'd severed contact with Maria. Let her believe he was just another corrupt cop who'd disappeared into Mexico's chaos. Better that than the truth, that her father had sold his soul for enough money to ensure she'd never need anything. Now his sacrifice meant nothing. The war he'd thought was over had simply been waiting for the right moment to begin. Frank holstered the weapon and grabbed his keys. The drive to San Diego would take 4 hours if he pushed hard and the border crossing cooperated. Time enough to pray he wasn't already too late. The weight of the Glock against his ribs felt heavier with each step toward the door. Frank paused at the threshold, his weathered hand gripping the doorframe as he turned back to survey the sanctuary he might never see again. 3 years of careful solitude spread before him like evidence of a crime he couldn't undo. The ceramic coffee mug still half full on the counter, steam rising like incense for a quiet life about to be sacrificed. His reading glasses lay folded beside yesterday's crossword puzzle, 7 across still blank, betrayal's consequence. The irony would have made him laugh if his throat wasn't so tight with fear. Outside, his beaten Ford pickup sat in the morning shadows, salt-crusted and reliable as the tides. Frank had bought it for cash 3 years ago from a fisherman's widow in Ensenada, specifically choosing something that wouldn't attract attention at border crossings. The engine turned over with a familiar rumble that seemed too loud in the coastal quiet. As he backed down the dirt driveway, Frank caught sight of his neighbor, Senora Martinez, hanging laundry on a line 50 meters away. She raised her hand in greeting, probably wondering why the quiet Americano was leaving so early. He'd told her once that he was a retired accountant from Los Angeles. The lie came so easily it had surprised him. She'd nodded politely and never asked again, respecting the invisible borders expatriates drew around their past lives. Now he wondered if she'd remember him when investigators came asking questions, if she'd describe how his hands moved like a man accustomed to violence despite his accountant's story. The coastal highway stretched north through brown hills dotted with scrub brush and mobile homes. Frank had driven this route dozens of times during his exile, usually heading to Ensenada for supplies or Tijuana to visit Roberto. But those had been leisurely drives, windows down, radio playing old ballads that reminded him of Elena. Now the truck felt like a weapon aimed at his own heart. His phone lay on the passenger seat, silent and accusatory. Frank had programmed Maria's number into speed dial but hadn't used it in 2 years. The last conversation had been brutal, her voice sharp with disappointment as she accused him of abandoning Diego when the boy needed grandfather figures most. She'd been right, of course. But how could he explain that staying away was the only protection he could offer? That every bedtime story he might read, every birthday party he might attend, carried the risk of bringing violence to their doorstep? Elena would have found a way to make it work. His wife had possessed an intuitive understanding of family bonds that Frank had always envied. She could have navigated the delicate balance between love and danger, probably would have moved Maria and Diego somewhere safe, and built a new life for all of them. But Elena had died before Frank's deal with the DEA, before the money, before the weight of betrayal had transformed him into someone she wouldn't have recognized. The guilt of that timeline still carved at him. Elena had fought cancer for 18 months while Frank worked narcotics, chasing cartel money and telling himself it was temporary. Just enough to pay for experimental treatments, just enough to secure their future. She died believing her husband was an honest cop who'd mortgaged their house to afford her care. The truth, that Frank had been skimming evidence money for months before her diagnosis, went with him to her grave. At the Tijuana border, Frank joined the slow procession of vehicles heading north. Border Patrol agents moved between cars with practiced efficiency, their young faces serious beneath peaked caps. Frank's retired police credentials still carried weight here, and his tourist visa remained valid for another year. But sweat collected between his shoulder blades as he handed over his documents, hyper-aware of the weapon pressed against his ribs. The agent glanced at his ID and waved him through without questions. Just another retired American heading home from his Mexican refuge. If only it were that simple. San Diego's sprawl emerged from coastal haze like a familiar nightmare. Frank had arrested his first drug dealer in these streets 35 years ago, a teenager selling crack outside a middle school in National City. The kid couldn't have been much older than Diego was now. Frank wondered sometimes what had happened to him, whether prison had hardened him into something worse or given him chances to change, whether choices made at 14 determined everything that followed, or if redemption was always possible. His daughter lived in Claremont Mesa, a middle-class neighborhood of tract homes and strip malls. Frank had driven past her house twice in 3 years, never stopping, just needing to see the life she'd built without him. Maria worked as a pediatric nurse at Children's Hospital, earned enough to keep Diego in good schools, dated occasionally but hadn't remarried since her divorce. She'd constructed exactly the stable, unremarkable existence Frank had hoped his money would buy her. Now El Chapo's patience had finally run out, and Frank's protection had become Diego's death sentence. Frank parked 3 blocks from Maria's house, muscle memory choosing a spot with clear sight lines and easy escape routes. The suburban street felt foreign after 3 years of coastal isolation. Too many windows, too many potential hiding spots, the kind of maze where hunters became hunted without warning. He left the engine running and checked his phone one more time. Still nothing from Maria. The house looked exactly as he remembered from his last surveillance drive 18 months ago. White stucco with blue trim, a small lawn Diego had probably outgrown by now, Maria's Honda Civic in the driveway beside a silver sedan Frank didn't recognize. The normalcy of it, sprinkler system watering flower beds, newspapers stacked on the porch, a child's bicycle leaning against the garage, made his chest tight with longing and terror. Frank was reaching for his door handle when his phone finally rang. But the number on the screen wasn't Maria's. It was Roberto's, and his former partner never called twice in one day unless someone was bleeding or dead. "Frank, where the hell are you?" Roberto's voice carried an edge Frank had heard only during the worst operations of their partnership. "Please tell me you're not in San Diego. I'm wherever I need to be. What's wrong?" "Everything's wrong. I've been making calls since I texted you, trying to figure out who's been asking questions." "Frank, it's not just someone, it's everyone. Federales, DEA, people I don't recognize with credentials that look too clean. They've been crawling through our old case files, asking about Operation Checkmate, about your retirement." Frank's blood turned to ice water. "How long?" "At least 2 weeks, maybe longer." They were subtle about it, professional. But when you work the same desk for 20 years, you notice when your files get rearranged. Roberto's breathing sounded labored, like he was moving fast. "Frank, there's something else. Something that's going to make you sick." The sedan in Maria's driveway suddenly looked wrong. Too clean, too anonymous. The kind of rental car federal agents preferred. "Tell me." Miguel Guzman never made it to his sentencing hearing. Prison transport was hit 3 months ago outside Guadalajara. 4 guards dead, Miguel vanished. But here's the part that'll kill you. The DEA knew. They fucking knew he was loose and they didn't warn you. Frank's vision narrowed to a tunnel. The phone felt slippery in his sweating palm. "That's impossible. Chen promised." "Chen's dead, Frank. Car accident 6 months ago. Except the accident investigator was dirty cartel money, and the brake lines were cut clean through." Roberto's voice dropped to a whisper. "Listen to me carefully. Whatever you think you know about Operation Checkmate, whatever the DEA told you, it was all bullshit from the beginning. I've been digging through old surveillance reports, cross-referencing dates with our arrest records. The night you gave them El Chapo's location, Miguel Guzman was supposed to be in Mexico City at his daughter's quinceañera. 300 witnesses, professional photographers, the works." Frank's mind reeled. "You're saying he was there deliberately? That someone wanted us to find him?" I'm saying you weren't betraying El Chapo for DEA money. You were delivering Miguel Guzman to someone who wanted Joaquin to suffer the way only a brother's loss can make a man suffer. And whoever orchestrated it has been moving pieces on this chessboard for years while you thought you were safe in your little beach house. The front door of Maria's house opened. Frank's heart stopped as he watched his daughter step onto the porch, but she wasn't alone. A tall woman in a dark suit followed her outside, moving with the precise economy of motion Frank recognized from 30 years of law enforcement. As they talked, the woman's body position remained angled toward the street, professional awareness disguised as casual conversation. "Roberto, I need you to run a plate for me." Frank read off the sedan's license number, his voice steady despite the panic clawing at his throat. "Hold on." The sound of typing came through the phone. "Shit, Frank. That's a federal motor pool vehicle registered to a DEA task force. But the assignment paperwork is classified above my clearance level. Are they protecting her or watching her? In this business, what's the difference?" Frank understood then, with the clarity that comes only in moments of perfect terror, that he had never been the protagonist of his own story. Every choice he thought he'd made freely, the decision to take cartel money, the deal with Agent Chen, even his exile to the beach house, had been carefully orchestrated moves in a game whose rules he'd never understood. El Chapo hadn't spent 3 years hunting him. El Chapo had spent 3 years positioning him like a chess piece being maneuvered into checkmate. The phone buzzed with an incoming text. "Come inside, Frank. We need to talk. Agent Williams, DEA." His sanctuary was gone. His isolation was over. And somewhere in the shadows, Joaquin Guzman was finally ready to spring whatever trap he'd been building since the night his brother disappeared into a federal prison transport that was always meant to be ambushed. Frank holstered his weapon and walked toward the house where his old life waited to die. Frank's legs felt like concrete as he approached the front door, each step a surrender to forces that had been orchestrating his movements long before he'd realized he was dancing to someone else's music. The suburban street seemed to hold its breath. No children playing, no lawnmowers running. Even the birds had gone quiet, as if nature itself recognized the moment when predator and prey finally met face to face. The woman in the dark suit had disappeared back inside, leaving only Maria visible through the front window. She stood with her arms crossed, that familiar defensive posture Frank remembered from her teenage years when she'd been caught breaking curfew. But this wasn't adolescent defiance. This was the stance of someone who'd been told truths that rearranged her understanding of everything she'd believed about her father. Frank raised his hand to knock, but the door opened before his knuckles touched wood. "Hello, Dad." Maria's voice carried no warmth, no surprise, just the flat tone of someone who'd been expecting this moment for hours. She looked older than he remembered, crow's feet around her eyes that hadn't been there during their last conversation. 3 years of estrangement had aged her in ways that made Frank's chest ache with regret. "Maria, save it." She stepped aside, gesturing him into the living room where Agent Williams waited beside the fireplace like she owned the place. "Agent Williams has been very educational about your retirement activities." Frank entered the house that smelled like his daughter's perfume and his grandson's breakfast cereal. Domestic normalcy that felt like a museum exhibit of the life he'd sacrificed for money and secrets. Agent Williams was younger than he'd expected, maybe 40, with short auburn hair, and the kind of alert stillness that came from years of dangerous work. She didn't offer to shake hands. "Detective Morales, or do you prefer Frank?" Williams studied him with eyes that missed nothing. "Please, sit down. We have a situation that requires your immediate cooperation. Where's Diego?" Frank remained standing, his hand unconsciously drifting toward the weapon beneath his jacket. "Safe," Williams replied, but something in her tone suggested that safety was conditional and temporary. "Your grandson is at school, surrounded by protection you can't see but should appreciate. The question is how long we can maintain that security." Maria moved to the window, peering through blinds with nervous energy that reminded Frank painfully of Elena during his most dangerous cases. "She says you stole money from drug dealers. She says people want to hurt Diego because of what you did. It's more complicated than that." "Is it?" Williams pulled a manila folder from her briefcase, spreading photographs across the coffee table like dealing cards. Because from where I sit, it looks fairly simple. You took $2 million in DEA cooperation money for information about Joaquin Guzman's whereabouts. That information led to the arrest of Miguel Guzman, who has since escaped federal custody and is presumed to be seeking revenge against everyone involved in his capture. Frank studied the photographs, surveillance shots of Miguel Guzman from various angles, mugshots from his arrest, images of the destroyed prison transport that had freed him. The family resemblance to El Chapo was strong, but Miguel's eyes held something his older brothers lacked, the wounded fury of someone who'd never chosen violence until violence chose him. "You know this isn't about Miguel," Frank said quietly. "He's not calling the shots." Williams smiled, but the expression held no humor. "Enlighten me." Joaquin is using his brother's escape as cover for something bigger. Miguel was never supposed to stay in prison. The whole arrest was theater designed to draw out whoever really wanted him captured. Frank moved closer to the photographs, pieces of a puzzle finally clicking into place. Someone paid me to betray Miguel's location, then arranged for his transport to be ambushed. Now both brothers are free, and Joaquin knows exactly who was involved in the conspiracy. That's an interesting theory. Williams began collecting the photographs. Unfortunately, theories don't stop bullets. What stops bullets is cooperation. Maria turned from the window, her nurse's training making her focus on practical concerns. "What kind of cooperation?" Williams looked directly at Frank. "The kind where your father helps us finish what he started 3 years ago. We know Joaquin Guzman is planning something significant. Our intelligence suggests a major operation targeting high-value individuals involved in his brother's arrest. We need someone with inside knowledge to help us anticipate his moves." Frank felt the trap closing around him, understanding with crystalline clarity that this conversation had been planned long before he'd received the photographs of Maria and Diego. "You're using my family as bait. We're offering your family protection in exchange for your expertise." Williams stood, her voice becoming crisp and official. "The alternative is that you return to Mexico and wait for El Chapo to decide how slowly he wants you to die." Outside, a car door slammed. Through the window, Frank could see Roberto's battered pickup truck in the driveway, his former partner climbing out with the careful movements of someone expecting trouble. The game was expanding, drawing in everyone Frank had ever trusted. And somewhere in the shadows, Joaquin Guzman was watching it all unfold exactly as he'd planned. Frank's stomach dropped as Roberto approached the house, his former partner's weathered face grim with the kind of news that changed everything. Through the window, Frank could see Roberto checking over his shoulder, the paranoid habits of 30 years in narcotics making him scan for threats even in this suburban sanctuary. "Expecting company?" Williams asked, her hand moving instinctively toward her concealed weapon. "My former partner, Roberto Vasquez." Frank moved toward the door, but Williams blocked his path. "Detective Vasquez wasn't invited to this conversation. Then you don't know Roberto." Frank pushed past her. "He doesn't wait for invitations when people are in danger." The knock came hard and urgent, 3 sharp raps followed by Roberto's voice. "Frank, open up. We've got problems." Maria looked between Frank and Williams, her nurse's intuition sensing the escalation. "How many people are going to show up in my living room today?" Frank opened the door to find Roberto holding a thick manila envelope, his dark eyes darting past Frank to catalog Williams' presence. "We need to talk, privately." "Nothing about this situation is private anymore," Williams interjected, stepping into Roberto's line of sight. "Agent Williams, DEA. You must be Detective Vasquez." Roberto's expression hardened. "Former detective, and you must be the federal agent who's been using Frank's family as chess pieces." He pushed past both of them into the living room, tossing the envelope onto the coffee table. "You want cooperation? Let's start with honesty." Williams picked up the envelope, her professional composure cracking slightly. "This is classified material." "Not anymore." Roberto's voice carried 30 years of accumulated anger. "Those are surveillance photos from Operation Checkmate, the real ones your people buried. Frank, you need to see what actually happened the night you thought you were betraying El Chapo." Frank opened the envelope with trembling hands, spilling photographs across Maria's coffee table. The images showed a compound at night, taken from multiple angles with telephoto lenses, but instead of showing Miguel Guzman's capture, they revealed something far more disturbing: Miguel walking freely out of the compound, unrestrained, talking casually with men in tactical gear. "Jesus Christ," Frank whispered. "It gets worse." Roberto pointed to a timestamp in the corner. "These were taken 4 hours after your arrest report was filed. Miguel wasn't captured that night. He was extracted. Someone used your intelligence to stage a fake arrest, then spirited him away to safety." Maria leaned over Frank's shoulder, studying the photographs with growing horror. "Dad, what does this mean?" Williams moved toward her briefcase, but Roberto stepped between her and the exit. "It means your father never betrayed El Chapo. He was set up to deliver Miguel to people who wanted him safe, not imprisoned. The whole operation was designed to make Frank look like a turncoat while keeping both Guzman brothers exactly where someone wanted them." The room fell silent except for the ticking of Maria's grandfather clock, each second marking the collapse of everything Frank thought he understood about his own life. He studied the photos again, recognizing some of the tactical gear as DEA equipment, seeing Miguel's relaxed body language of a man among allies rather than captors. Who? Frank's voice came out as a croak. Who wanted him protected? Roberto pulled out his phone, scrolling through messages. "I've been working that angle all morning. Called in favors, pressed old contacts, followed money trails that should have stayed buried." His finger stopped on a text message. "Frank, the $2 million you received, it didn't come from DEA operational funds. It came from a private account registered to a shell company in the Cayman Islands." Williams finally spoke, her voice tight with barely controlled panic. "You have no idea what you're interfering with. Enlighten me." Roberto turned on her, decades of interrogation experience making his stare physically uncomfortable. "Tell me why a DEA agent is more worried about our questions than she is about a cartel leader threatening a child." The silence stretched until Maria broke it, her voice small and confused. "Dad, if you didn't betray anyone, why do they want to hurt Diego?" Frank felt the last piece of the puzzle slide into place, the truth hitting him like a physical blow. "Because I know something I'm not supposed to know. Something I witnessed that night that I haven't even realized yet." He looked at Williams, seeing confirmation in her frightened eyes. "The question is, what did I see, and who's been afraid for 3 years that I'd remember?" Roberto's phone buzzed with an incoming call. He glanced at the screen and went pale. "Frank, we need to leave. Now." "Who is it?" "Miguel Guzman, and he says he has information about who really killed Agent Chen." The grandfather clock chimed noon, its cheerful melody absurdly innocent in the suffocating atmosphere of accumulated secrets. Frank realized that everything, his exile, his guilt, his family's danger, had been built on a foundation of lies so complex that even the liars had lost track of the truth. But someone remembered. Someone was afraid enough to orchestrate 3 years of deception, and that someone was about to discover that Frank Morales had finally stopped running. Roberto answered the phone on speaker, his voice steady despite the tension radiating from his shoulders. "Miguel." "Detective Vasquez." The voice that emerged from the phone was softer than Frank had expected, educated, carrying the weight of genuine grief. "Is Frank there? I think it's time we talked." Frank stepped closer to the phone, his mouth dry. "I'm here." "Good. Because we have a mutual problem, and I'm tired of watching innocent people suffer for other men's games." Miguel's words carried an exhaustion that Frank recognized, the bone-deep weariness of someone who'd discovered that everything he'd believed was a lie. Agent Chen didn't die in any car accident. She was murdered because she found out the truth about Operation Checkmate. Williams lunged for the phone, but Roberto caught her wrist. "Let him talk." "The truth?" Frank's voice cracked. "What truth?" "That my brother and I have been pawns in someone else's war for the past 3 years. That the night you thought you betrayed El Chapo, you actually saved both our lives by exposing a conspiracy that goes deeper than cartel politics." Miguel paused, and Frank could hear traffic in the background, the sound of someone moving fast. "Frank, who recruited you for the DEA operation? Who first approached you with the offer?" Frank's blood turned to ice as the memory crystallized. Agent Williams. She said, I never recruited you. Williams's voice was barely a whisper, her face ashen. That was Agent Morrison. He handled all the initial contacts. Roberto released her wrist, stepping back as understanding dawned. Where is Agent Morrison now? Dead, Williams replied, her professional mask finally cracking completely. Killed in a helicopter crash in Colombia 6 months ago, along with Agent Chen and 2 other investigators who'd been asking questions about Operation Checkmate funding. Maria sank into her chair, her hand pressed to her mouth. How many people have died because of this? Miguel's voice returned, harder now. Too many. But it's going to stop today because Frank is going to remember what he saw that night. Something that scared Morrison enough to fake my arrest, stage my brother's manhunt, and eliminate anyone who got too close to the truth. Frank closed his eyes, forcing himself back to that night 3 years ago. The compound, the darkness, the moment when he'd pointed out Miguel's location to the tactical team. But there had been something else, something that had bothered him at the time, but gotten lost in the chaos and guilt that followed. The other man, Frank said suddenly. There was another man in the compound that night. American expensive suit, talking on a satellite phone when the operation started. He left in a separate vehicle before any arrests were made. The silence on the phone stretched for 10 seconds that felt like hours. Describe him. Miguel's voice was urgent now. Tall, silver hair, scar on his left cheek, late 50s, maybe early 60s. He was giving orders to the tactical team, but he wasn't wearing any agency identification. Williams made a sound like a wounded animal. Oh, God. Frank, you saw David Richardson. Roberto's face went white. The Richardson? Assistant Director Richardson? Former Assistant Director, Williams corrected, her voice hollow. He retired 2 years ago to pursue private security contracts. Except his retirement was actually cover for his real business, selling protection and intelligence to the highest bidders, including cartels who needed their leadership, kept safe from rival operations. Frank felt the world tilt on its axis as 30 years of assumptions crumbled. Richardson was protecting the Guzman brothers. He used Operation Checkmate to extract them from a legitimate DEA investigation, then staged their manhunt to keep other agencies from looking too closely at their activities. And when Agent Chen started connecting the dots, Miguel added, Richardson began eliminating everyone who could expose his operation, including the detectives who'd provided the initial intelligence. Maria stood up abruptly, her face pale but determined. I need to get Diego, right now. It's too late for that, Williams said quietly. Richardson's people have been watching the school since this morning. The protection detail I mentioned? They're not our agents. The room exploded into motion. Roberto reached for his weapon, Frank moved toward the window, and Maria grabbed her phone to call the school. But before anyone could act, Frank's phone buzzed with a text message from an unknown number. The message contained a single photograph, Diego sitting in what appeared to be a black SUV, his small face pressed against the window, eyes wide with confusion and fear. Below the image, a simple message. Richardson sends his regards. Time to finish this properly. Frank stared at the photo, understanding with perfect clarity that he had never been the hunter or the hunted, but simply a tool in someone else's arsenal. Richardson had used his guilt and isolation to keep him quiet for 3 years. But now that the truth was emerging, the old spy master was ready to tie up loose ends with the brutal efficiency that had made him legendary in intelligence circles. He has my grandson, Frank said, his voice deadly calm. And that was his first mistake. The silence that followed Frank's words carried the weight of 3 decades of police work, crystallizing into a single moment of absolute clarity. He set the phone down with deliberate precision, his movements taking on the focused economy of a man who had finally stopped running from his past and started hunting his future. Miguel, are you still there? Frank's voice cut through the tension like a blade. I'm here. And Frank, I've been tracking Richardson's movements for months. He's not as untouchable as he thinks. Williams stepped forward, her agency training warring with the reality unfolding around her. You can't seriously be considering working with a fugitive cartel member. Former cartel member, Miguel corrected through the speaker. My brother and I have been trying to get out of the business for years. Richardson's protection came with strings. Strings that required us to stay visible enough to take heat off his other operations. We've been prisoners wearing crowns. Roberto moved to Maria's window, scanning the street with eyes that had survived 30 years of cartel warfare. 2 black SUVs, half a block down. They're not even trying to hide anymore. He turned back to the room, his weathered face grim with determination. This ends today one way or another. Frank felt something shifting inside him. The guilt and self-doubt that had defined the last 3 years burning away like fog before sunlight. Maria, I need you to listen to me very carefully. Do you remember the emergency bag your mother always kept in the hall closet? Dad, that was 20 years ago. The principle's the same. Grab essentials for you and Diego. Medications, documents, cash if you have it. We're going to get him back, but after that you both need to disappear for a while. Maria's nurse training kicked in. The crisis management skills that had carried her through emergency rooms now applied to her own family's survival. Where? My whole life is here. Your whole life is Diego, Roberto said quietly. Everything else can be rebuilt. Williams pulled out her phone, her fingers flying across the screen. I can arrange protective custody, safe houses, new identities if necessary. But it has to go through proper channels. Proper channels got Agent Chen killed, Frank replied, surprising himself with the steel in his voice. Proper channels have been compromised for years. Miguel, what's your location? Downtown San Diego, about 20 minutes from you. I have resources, clean vehicles, weapons, communications equipment that Richardson doesn't know about. But Frank, you need to understand something. Once we move against him, there's no going back. Richardson has connections in every major agency. If we fail, everyone in that room with you dies. Frank looked at his daughter, really looked at her for the first time since arriving. She had Elena's stubborn chin, the same determination that had carried her mother through decades as a cop's wife, but she also had something Elena had never needed, the cold pragmatism that came from years of making life and death decisions in trauma bays. What do you need from me? Maria asked, and Frank heard his wife's voice echoing across 23 years. The question hung in the air, loaded with implications that went far beyond the immediate crisis. Frank realized that this was the conversation he'd been avoiding for 3 years, not just about his betrayal, real or imagined, but about the kind of man he'd chosen to become when everything went wrong. I need you to trust me, he said finally, even though I've given you no reason to, even though I abandoned you when you needed me most. I need you to believe that everything I did wrong I did because I was trying to protect you from exactly this moment. Williams interrupted, her voice tight with barely controlled desperation. This is insane. You're talking about going up against a man with unlimited resources, no oversight, and a 30-year head start on covering his tracks. Even if you rescue your grandson, Richardson will never stop hunting you. Then we make sure Richardson stops breathing, Roberto said matter-of-factly, checking his service weapon with the automatic motions of muscle memory. Some problems only have permanent solutions. Miguel's voice crackled through the speaker. Frank, decision time. Richardson's moving Diego to a secondary location in approximately 30 minutes. After that, finding him becomes exponentially more difficult. Are you ready to finish what someone else started 3 years ago? Frank looked around the room, at Roberto, whose loyalty had survived decades of corruption and betrayal, at Williams, whose fear was finally honest, at Maria, whose strength was his own legacy made manifest. 3 years ago, he'd thought he was selling information for money. 6 months ago, he'd thought he was hiding from cartel justice. 6 hours ago, he'd thought he was protecting his family from his past mistakes. Now he understood that he'd been preparing for war. Miguel, Frank said, his voice carrying the weight of 30 years of choices finally aligning toward a single purpose. Tell me where to meet you, and bring everything. Miguel's coordinates led them to a warehouse in Barrio Logan, 20 minutes through San Diego traffic that felt like hours. Frank drove Williams's sedan while Roberto rode shotgun, both men falling back into the rhythm of partnership that had carried them through countless operations decades ago. In the back seat, Williams worked her phone frantically, calling in favors from the few people she still trusted, while Maria sat in rigid silence, her nurses training the only thing keeping her functional. The warehouse sat in the shadow of the Coronado Bridge, surrounded by legitimate shipping businesses that provided perfect cover for illegitimate activities. Frank parked between two cargo containers, the metal walls blocking sightlines from the street. The air smelled of diesel fuel and ocean salt, familiar scents that carried him back to 1,000 similar moments when everything had been simpler. Miguel emerged from the shadows like a ghost, and Frank felt a shock of recognition. This wasn't the hardened cartel leader he'd expected, but a man who could have passed for any middle-aged businessman. Graying temples, expensive but understated clothing, the kind of quiet competence that made him invisible in crowds. Only his eyes betrayed the weight he carried, the same exhaustion Frank saw in his own mirror. "You look older," Miguel said without preamble, studying Frank's face with clinical interest. 3 years of guilt will do that. Frank stepped closer, noting how Miguel's bodyguards, 2 men who radiated professional competence, maintained respectful distance. "You look like someone who's been carrying secrets he never wanted." An accurate assessment. Miguel gestured toward a table covered with surveillance equipment, photographs, and documents. "David Richardson has been playing a longer game than any of us realized. Operation Checkmate wasn't just about protecting my brother and me, it was about positioning Richardson as the puppet master for half the major cartel operations on the West Coast." Roberto examined the photographs, his detective's eye cataloging details with mechanical precision. "Jesus, how many agencies has he compromised?" "Enough," Miguel's voice carried the weight of awful knowledge. "DEA, Border Patrol, even select elements within FBI and ATF. Richardson sold protection to anyone willing to pay, then used that intelligence to eliminate competition. Your grandson isn't just leverage, Frank. He's the final move in a game that's been running for years." Williams looked up from her phone, her face pale. "I just got word from headquarters. There's no rescue operation planned, no tactical response. According to official records, Diego was never taken." The implications hit Frank like a physical blow. Richardson wasn't just operating outside official channels. He'd erased their situation from existence. No cavalry was coming, because nobody in authority even knew a crime had been committed. "Then we handle this ourselves," Frank said, surprised by the steadiness in his own voice. "Miguel, what do you need from me?" "The truth about what you saw that night. Every detail, no matter how insignificant it seemed at the time." Miguel pulled out a tablet displaying satellite imagery of the compound where Operation Checkmate had unfolded. "Richardson thinks he's eliminated everyone who could threaten his operation, but he made one mistake. He assumed you'd never remember what you witnessed." Frank closed his eyes, forcing himself back to that night. The darkness, the tactical teams moving with practiced precision, Miguel's surprised face when the assault began. But there had been something else, something that had nagged at him for years without crystallizing into conscious memory. "The documents," Frank said suddenly, his eyes snapping open. "Richardson was carrying a briefcase when he left, but before the operation started, I saw him photographing papers, documents that were spread across a table in the compound's main room. He wasn't just extracting you, he was stealing intelligence." Miguel's expression shifted, the businessman mask slipping to reveal something harder underneath. "What kind of papers?" "Maps, financial records, but also—" Frank struggled to bring the memory into focus. Communication logs, frequencies, call signs, operational schedules. He was photographing other agencies' classified materials. The warehouse fell silent except for the distant sound of traffic on the bridge above. Roberto was the first to speak, his voice heavy with understanding. He was selling law enforcement intelligence to cartels, then selling cartel intelligence back to law enforcement, playing both sides while eliminating anyone who got too close to the middle. "Including Agent Chen when she started tracking financial irregularities," Williams added, her phone forgotten in her hand. "And now including us, because we've connected enough dots to threaten his entire operation." Miguel walked to a weapons case, his movements deliberate and final. Richardson's weakness isn't his resources or his connections, it's his arrogance. He's built an empire on the assumption that he's always the smartest person in the room. But he's about to discover that 3 decades of police work, cartel survival, and federal training make a formidable combination when focused on a single target. Frank felt the last of his guilt burn away, replaced by something he hadn't experienced in 3 years: absolute clarity of purpose. Richardson had stolen his peace, his family, and his identity. But most unforgivably, he'd threatened Diego, an innocent child whose only crime was being loved by the wrong grandfather. "Tell me where he is," Frank said, accepting the weapon Miguel offered him. "And let's finish this." The safe house sat 2 miles inland from the Pacific, close enough to hear the ocean's rhythm, but far enough to feel like sanctuary. Frank stood on the deck as dawn painted the horizon in shades of amber and rose, his hands wrapped around a coffee cup that had gone cold an hour ago. The weight of the Glock at his hip felt strange now, unnecessary in a way it hadn't for 33 years. 3 days had passed since Richardson's body was found in the burned-out remains of his private warehouse, along with enough evidence to trigger the largest corruption investigation in DEA history. The official report would list it as a cartel execution, which wasn't entirely inaccurate. Miguel had vanished before the flames died down, taking his secrets and his second chance into whatever new identity $2 million could buy. Frank hoped he'd use it wisely. "Can't sleep either?" Maria's voice came from behind him, soft with the exhaustion that followed days of pure adrenaline. "Old habit." Frank turned to find his daughter holding 2 fresh cups of coffee, her face bearing the kind of hollowed calm that came after surviving the unthinkable. "How's Diego?" "Resilient. Too resilient, maybe." Maria handed him a cup and leaned against the deck railing. "He thinks the whole thing was an adventure. Keeps asking when Uncle Miguel is coming back." Frank smiled despite himself. Miguel had charmed Diego during the brief window between rescue and separation, spinning tales of treasure hunting and secret missions that transformed trauma into story. It was perhaps the kindest lie Frank had ever witnessed. "Williams called an hour ago," Maria continued. "The Justice Department is offering U.S. permanent relocation, new identities, the full witness protection package. They want your testimony about Richardson's network." "What did you tell her?" "That I'd talk to my father." Maria studied his profile in the morning light. The man who came back to save his grandson. Not the one who ran away 3 years ago. Frank felt something break loose in his chest. 3 years of carefully constructed isolation crumbling like sandcastles at high tide. "I never stopped being your father, Maria. I just stopped believing I deserved to be. And now?" He considered the question while watching pelicans dive for fish in the surf below. Richardson's death had closed one chapter, but it hadn't erased the preceding 30 years. Frank was still the cop who'd bent rules, still the man who'd taken money for information, still the father who'd chosen isolation over connection when his family needed him most. But he was also the grandfather who'd walked into hell for a 6-year-old boy's safety. "Now I think maybe deserving isn't the point," Frank said finally. "Maybe it's just about showing up." "Dad," Maria's voice carried a weight that made him turn fully toward her. "I need you to understand something. When Diego was taken, when I thought I might lose him, the person I called out for wasn't his father. It wasn't Roberto, or Williams, or anyone else. It was you. Even after 3 years of silence, even after all the hurt and confusion, you were still the person I trusted to bring him home." Frank felt tears he hadn't shed since Elena's funeral burning behind his eyes. "I don't know how to be the man you remember." "I don't want the man I remember," Maria replied, surprising him with her directness. "I want the man you are now, the one who's learned that running away doesn't protect anyone, the one who knows the difference between guilt and responsibility." A pelican landed on the deck railing, regarding them with ancient, patient eyes before launching itself back toward the waves. Frank watched its flight, thinking about the strange mathematics of redemption, how 3 days of right choices couldn't erase 30 years of wrong ones, but might begin to balance the equation. "The house in Baja," Frank said quietly. "I want to sell it. Use the money for Diego's college fund." "Dad, you don't have to." "I'm not running away again," Frank interrupted. "But I'm not hiding either. If we take Williams's offer, we do it as a family. New names, new lives, but together. Maria was quiet for a long moment, studying his face with the careful assessment she'd learned in emergency rooms. Finally, she smiled, the first genuine smile he'd seen from her since arriving in San Diego. Elena used to say that courage wasn't about not being afraid, she said. It was about being afraid and showing up anyway. Frank nodded, understanding that this was his wife's final gift, her wisdom preserved in their daughter's voice, offering him one last chance to choose connection over isolation. The morning sun climbed higher, burning away the last of the coastal mist, and Frank Morales stood with his daughter on a deck overlooking the Pacific, finally ready to stop running from the man he'd been and start becoming the man his family needed him to be.